those green-robed senators of mighty woods. Tall oaks, branch charmed by the earnest stars, dream, and so dream all night without a stir. That is what Keats had to say about oak trees. I don't think I can beat his words, but there really is something quite special about them. Now, we often hear winemakers talking about oak, but what do we actually mean? Firstly, most people assume we're talking about barrels of different sizes. Barrels are very expensive, up to €3,000 for a standard-sized one, in fact. And that only stores 300 bottles of wine. So that can add up to £10 to the cost of the wine. Let's start off looking at how barrels are made, because you might be surprised at how intricate it is. Firstly, an old oak tree that is the perfect shape and size is found to cut down. These are normally around 100 years old. They're cut or split into planks, and these are left in giant piles to be seasoned for about a year or so. During this time, microorganisms start doing some work on them and changing the characteristics of the wood, and it all just mellows. When it comes time to be used, the planks are planed and smoothed to make the final shapes for the barrel. These are then arranged into a flower shape with a hoop at the bottom. After this, they are toasted. That is, a fire is lit in the middle of it, and the wood is left to generate a little bit of a crust, and we'll come to why later. The barrel is squeezed into the right shape, and more hoops are pushed down, before adding tops and bottoms, and being tested and made water and wine tight. It turns out that wine is less dense than water, so it leaks even more. Now, we use oak in wine for two different reasons. First is the flavour that they add. Flavours like vanillin, but secondly, they let a tiny amount of air into the wine which helps it mature. Too much is very bad, but too little makes for a harsher wine. We'll talk about the flavours first. You'll perhaps not be shocked to learn that not all breeds of oak tree are the same. Some are even poisonous. It's like the difference between an Earl Grey and a Lapsang Souchong tea. Some is in the type of plant and some is in how it's treated. The two main types are what's called French oak or American oak. French oak's generally regarded as higher quality. That's a bit unfair, it's just associated with a certain flavour profile. American oak is generally a little sweeter, but there's also Hungarian oak which is rising in popularity. We often talk about food pairing, but there's definitely pairings which work better with wood as well. French oak goes best with Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, while American oak is better with Zinfandel and Tempranillo, such as in Rioja. But it's not just the type of oak, that toasting has a huge effect. If you don't toast it, the wine tastes, well, of oak. But beyond this, it generally makes the wine taste sweeter, then adds flavours of vanilla, crusty toast, nuts and smoke before finally ending up acrid and burnt. Many winemakers like to use a blend of wines aged in different kinds of oak treated differently. The sheer number of different compounds this adds gives real complexity to the wine. But young barrels also act like sponges. They absorb the wine several bottles worth. It's much worse for a cut oak, like American, than it is for wood that's split along the grain, like French oak. The older the barrels, the more subdued the flavouring effect gets. Really old barrels are known as neutral, which means they add a negligible amount of flavour. Most barrels are around 225 litres. The bigger the barrel, the less flavour it adds, because while there might be more wine, there's less oak touching the wine. The biggest oak fermenter we've ever come across is this one, Hercules. This took 20 master coopers 3 whole months to make. I can't even imagine how much that one costs. Of course, wineries are businesses, and using oak adds an awful lot of cost and complexity, so the accountants wanted to try to find a cheaper way. The first thing that winemakers did to add oak flavours was to dip staves or spirals, big chunks of oak on strings, into the wine as it sat in the steel tanks, a bit like dunking a tea bag. Large-scale winemakers want to get the wine out as soon as possible, so rather than use one big lump of wood, breaking it into smaller chips makes that process much faster. But it is coarser too. You start getting the bad characteristics from the wood as well. But it's the only cost-effective way to add an oaky character to a budget bottle of wine. But this is what led to the over-oaked reputation of some Australian and American Chardonnays that just ruined this poor innocent grape. Anyway, the other side, aging. Without going too sciencey, the young harsh tannins in wine, which largely come from the skins, need to link up together with other tannins, and some of these come from the wood too, but to do that, they need oxygen. Luckily, wood is a little porous, and so lets in that tiny amount of air necessary to join those compounds together or polymerise them, which is to form longer, smoother chains, mixtures of wine and oak tannins, which are much, much more pleasant. Too much oxygen, however, and all of your fruit flavours will get destroyed. Of course, Accountants are still looking for shortcuts, and people have found ways to try to get this micro-oxygen effect by putting small pipes into the stainless steel tanks that allow a little bit of oxygen to seep in and bubble through. Other people are trying to reduce the price of oak by using some really creative solutions. These ones from Ribarique are very cool. They have oak staves in a cuboid tank, which is far more space efficient, and they're flat, so it's much easier to take them apart, plane them down and re-toast them, making it much more reusable. Finally, there's the question of when you use the oak and for how long. The longer you leave the wine in contact with oak, the more of an effect it has. From our discussions with winemakers, there's some vastly different ideas about which stage is best to use it. Fermenting an oak certainly gives a very different flavour to aging an oak. But this is yet another part of winemaking which comes down to a mystical combination of art and science, and you can't look at it just on its own. Each winemaker's crafting their own technique and has their own views about oak, which imparts a really unique style on the wine, and it either works as a whole piece or not. It's not just what they do with that one thing. Oak can be brilliant. It can be so subtle it just changes the texture of the wine, or it can slap you in the face. Winemakers are increasingly shying away from the in-your-face style and are seeking out subtleties in how these simple, natural materials can be brought together to form something which is utterly magical.